Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, if you've ever found yourself just completely exhausted by a pointless online debate, or kind of scratching your head wondering why a genuinely brilliant friend of yours believes something completely bananas, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are unpacking an essential survival guide for modern discourse, straight from a really fascinating textbook chapter on logical fallacies in open technical communication. We are going to arm you with a mental toolbox that will help you cut through all the noise, spot bad reasoning from a mile away, and actually start having productive conversations.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Why we believe nonsense. 2. The logic toolbox. 3. Spotting common fallacies. 4. The fallacy. And 5. How to argue fruitfully. This setup is going to save you a ton of time and, honestly, a lot of headaches when you're dealing with internet trolls or flawed logic.
Okay, let's dive straight into section 1, why we believe nonsense. It's a fantastic question, right? Why do brilliant people believe total nonsense? Well, the source material gives us a really fascinating evolutionary perspective on this. Basically, our brains didn't evolve to be perfect, rigorous logic processing machines. Nope, they evolved for pure survival in early agrarian societies. We developed these cognitive shortcuts to help us cooperate, raise families, fit into the group, essentially just to stay alive and breed. So our brains are actually hardwired to think in ways that boost our self-confidence and keep the social peace, rather than constantly seeking out the cold, hard, objective truth. And because of that, even the literal smartest people on Earth are super susceptible to falling for nonsense if they aren't actively paying attention to how they process information. This whole quirk of human nature is perfectly captured by the author George Eliot. Quote, "The dull mind, once arriving at an inference that flatters the desire, is rarely able to retain the impression that the notion from which the inference started was purely problematic." In plain English, when an idea flatters us, when it tells us exactly what we want to hear, our brains just completely gloss over the massive logical holes that got us there. We totally ignore the weak setup because we just love the punchline so much. And that is exactly why we can't just trust our gut feelings. We actually have to learn the grammar of logic to protect ourselves. Which brings us to section 2, the logic toolbox. We really need a reliable way to deconstruct these complex arguments without getting completely lost in the weeds. So the most fundamental tool in your brand new logic toolbox is called the syllogism. You can think of it as the core building block of literally any argument. It is remarkably simple. It goes like this. Step 1, premise 1. Step 2, premise 2. Step 3, the conclusion. The classic textbook example is premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. So whenever you're staring down a really confusing or long-winded argument, try to strip it back to these basic steps. Then ask yourself 2 absolutely crucial questions. Do I actually agree with the premises? And does the conclusion actually logically follow from those premises? If the answer is no to either of those, the whole argument just falls apart. All right, now that we've got the basics down, let's open this toolbox up a bit more. Section 3, spotting common fallacies. We're going to walk through a curated rogues gallery from our source of the classic reasoning errors that constantly trip us up. First up is bifurcation. You might also know this as the false dilemma or the black and white fallacy. Basically, arguments using this trap present us with only 2 extreme options, option A or option B. They try to make you feel like you absolutely must pick one, while completely ignoring the fact that there's a perfectly viable option C or D or even E out there. Let's look at this Game of Thrones example straight from the text. Either you support House Stark or you're a traitor to the Rome. See what's happening there? It's taking a massively complex political landscape and oversimplifying it to force a false choice. I mean, you could support House Targaryen, you could stay totally neutral, or you could oppose all the noble houses altogether. The big takeaway here, whenever someone gives you only 2 extreme alternatives, your very first instinct should be to hunt for that hidden middle ground. Next in our lineup is the straw man fallacy. Picture a student. Let's call him Jack. Jack misses class because he has the flu, and he tells his professor he's bringing a doctor's note. But the next day, the professor announces to everyone that he won't excuse the absence because Jack's excuse was simply that he didn't feel like coming. The professor completely ignores the actual strong argument, the literal flu and the medical note, and instead builds this weak, totally distorted version of Jack's argument. Sure, it's incredibly easy to knock down a straw man, but doing that means you aren't actually engaging with the truth. Moving right along, we have the classic slippery slope.
This is when an arguer claims that one single isolated change is going to inevitably snowball into a completely ridiculous disaster. Take this beautifully absurd example from the text where someone protests a change in marriage laws by yelling, "Next thing you know, people will want to marry toasters." Look, when you hear a slippery slope argument like this, you really have to stop and ask, is there any actual concrete evidence that this exact chain of events is truly inevitable? Spoiler alert, usually there isn't.
Okay, this next one always makes me laugh. It's the non sequitur, which literally translates from Latin to "it does not follow." Check out this argument. Darth Vader uses the Force, so he'd be great at baking cookies, right? There is absolutely zero connection between wielding the Force and knowing your way around a chocolate chip cookie recipe. The conclusion just completely fails to follow the premise. And while most real-life non sequiturs aren't quite this hilarious, the fundamental logical leap is exactly the same. And then we have the sweeping generalization. Let's look at this one. First-year college students are all irresponsible and just want to party instead of study. The huge red flag here, the word all. Always, always watch out for absolute words like all, always, or never. This fallacy unfairly takes what might be true for a tiny subset of people and just blankets it over a massive group, completely ignoring the thousands of intensely focused, disciplined students out there. So, you've learned a handful of fallacies, and you're probably feeling pretty confident, right? Well, hold on a second. Let's pivot to section 4, the fallacy. The text actually calls this the troll trap. Behold the fallacy. This means improperly connecting a fallacy with an argument, so the argument is mistakenly presumed to be totally debunked. I mean, we see this all the time on the internet. Someone just screams ad hominem or straw man in a comment section and basically does a virtual victory dance. But here's the thing. Just naming a fallacy doesn't automatically mean you've won the debate. It doesn't even mean you've properly understood the other person's point in the first place. The source text breaks down exactly how internet trolls fall face first into this trap. First, they often just completely misunderstand the fallacy to begin with. Second, they completely fail to appreciate nuance. Like if someone quotes Albert Einstein on a complex physics question, a troll might jump in and yell, "Appeal to authority." But actually, citing a legitimate expert in their specific relevant field isn't a fallacy at all, it's just good evidence. And finally, they assume a thorough debunking way too prematurely, completely missing the wider context of what's actually being discussed. Which brings us home to our final section, Section 5, How to Argue Fruitfully. We spent a lot of time talking about bad arguments, but what is the actual solution? Well, for that, we're looking at a literal masterclass in diplomacy from American historical figure Benjamin Franklin. Fun fact, early in his life, Ben Franklin actually loved humiliating his opponents in debates. He was basically an 18th century internet troll. But he eventually realized that this just disgusted people and completely failed to persuade them of anything. So he flipped his entire strategy. He started using these very specific, tentative phrases like, "I conceive a thing to be," or "it appears to me," or "if I am not mistaken." He deliberately stripped out dogmatic, absolute words like "certainly" or "undoubtedly." And by leading with humility instead of acting like an insufferable know-it-all, he became one of the most masterful persuaders and negotiators in history. And that leaves us with this final, genuinely powerful question to reflect on. When you step into a debate, are you arguing just to win and absolutely crush your opponent? Or are you arguing to genuinely learn and uncover the truth? If you use the logic toolbox we unpacked today, not as a weapon to attack people, but as a lens to clearly examine ideas, and yeah, that includes your own ideas, you are going to find that your conversations become incredibly fruitful. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope you're eager to take these tools out into the wild the next time you're navigating the crazy world of modern discourse.